Hello and welcome to the panel of Wanda Czełkowska Symposium accompanying Wanda Czełkowska Artists Not Rest exhibition at Muzeum Susz. Wanda Czełkowska was a key figure of Polish avant-garde, whose oeuvre remained almost unnoticed by art history until recently. One only needs to mention that her first extensive retrospective exhibition in her home country was held as the artist was 86 years old. Yes, and I have a pleasure to moderate and share this conversation with prominent speakers and specialists in the field. Please let me introduce them in alphabetic order. So Matthew Copeland is a curator, lecturer, and publisher. He develops a curatorial practice that seeks to subvert the traditional role of exhibition and renew our perception of them. Copeland co-curated famous exhibition Voids, a retrospective at the Centre Pompidou in Paris and in the Kunsthalle in Bern, and a number of other exhibitions. David Crowley teaches at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. He's a historian and curator with an interest in East Europe under communist rule. He has curated a number of fascinating exhibitions, quite many also in Poland, especially in a Museum of Art in Łódź. Sarah Wilson is a professor of modern art and contemporary art at the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London. She is an art historian and curator whose interests extend from post-war and Cold War Europe and the USSR to contemporary global art. And Agnieszka is a curator and researcher from 2011 to 2021. She was the chief curator of the Ksawery Dunikowski Museum of Sculpture, a division of the National Museum in Warsaw, while managing the biggest Polish collection of classical sculpture. She combined traditional museum practices with experimental curatorial strategies. From January 22, she has been the head of the collection department of the Museum of Art in Warsaw. And what is important in this, in our gathering, that Agnieszka knew Wanda Czełkowska and worked with her. Thanks to her effort, the first big retrospective of the artist was organized in Królikarnia in 2017. Also, in fact, Sarah Wilson also met Wanda Czełkowska. I hope this will be also part of this conversation, the in fact status of her the reception of the artist. And as the last, so my name is Agnieszka Sosnowska, and I'm a curator of discursive program at Muzeum Susz and also the assistant professor at the Institute of Art of the Polish Academy of Science. This panel will revolve around the role and position of Czełkowska in the context of European, however not exclusively, sculpture. So I will start with a question that maybe I will direct it now to Agnieszka, but with this invitation that each of you can contribute. Like many artists of her generation, Wanda Czełkowska rejected the label of a woman artist by referring to herself as a professional sculptor, not sculptress. She demanded to be treated equally to male artists in a period when structural inequality was significant. She did not want the gender issue to affect her work. This stand, however, did not save her from sharing a fate similar to many other female artists who received deserved attention far too late. She believed in a poor art. In Poland, we call Czełkowska artystka osobna, what means individual artist, an artist who follow an own path. She did not make compromises. Today, of course, we are fascinated like this attitude of Czełkowska. However, it doesn't mean it was an easy path. And Agnieszka, could you please tell us more about her attitude and this deep belief in art?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for asking me this profound question. First of all, I have to share my gratitude that I'm included in such a great meeting with great researchers and academics. My practice is much more practical, and I also worked very directly with objects and with artists. And Wanda for me was, I think, much more than just a professional partner. So being in this process of first exhibition organized after she passed away, it's a kind of struggle for me, because I can't stop myself from asking this question: what would Wanda said? How would she reacted at the exhibition, or how would she like text from the book? And one thing that I'm absolutely sure, that she would be thrilled with the book. She would be absolutely happy with all your beautiful text and all those associations and readings of her work. Because as she never wanted to be enlisted to any group or situated in any established, recognized art places, definitely she wanted to be understood. And I think what you all have done, and what exhibition is still doing, it's a big step in direction of understanding her art. So this difficulties which she faced in her life, and which can be also still recognized as difficulties in the process of making her art recognizable. Of course, changed, varied during the time. And you asked me about this problem of gender, and what I also tried to explain in my text. And actually, I kind of understand this explained it for myself actually during writing this text. And this is one of the matter which makes her art very up to date and very understandable for, I think, younger generation of the audience. Because what was always very, very vivid during the exhibition of Wanda, I've seen many of them, the London one in Ropa Gallery, in Królikarnia, now in Sush, and many exhibitions in Poland when she took part. I always observed very personal reactions of people, very emotional. Even if she was not recognized as a star artist, the reaction for her work are also very emotional. And what was very striking in her attitude and in her art, it's very gentle. She was in a very gentle way, she was a humanist. And this very very gentle, a very specific but very warm approach is and being a woman and being a woman artist is a part of that. It was very much recognized that her path was developing from the representation of the human body in front of the abstraction and working with the space and numbers and mathematics and geometry. And I remember, I think, David, it was you who used this term of the anthropomorphization of her art. And I wouldn't agree. I find it that she was, that she resigned from representation of the human body, but the human body was always there, is still there, as human body is a measurement of her work, as her curved line has always have size of a hand. It could be a hand of a forearm, of the whole arm, and also the geometrical works as absolute elimination of sculpture, as a notion of shape. We are the bodies. We are embodied selves who are entering the space, the scene. So we are entering with our gender, with our flesh, with our emotions. And even if the work is so, at the first sight, simple, geometrical and abstract, it's still very much humanist. As I tried to explain to myself writing the text, this tension between her very strong femininity and between her will to be recognized, not as a woman sculptor, but as an artist, as a sculptor, as a professionalist. And as Eva Opałka and many other researchers wanted to see this tension as something violent, and seeing the kind of violence in her art, the shape of the heads, and this act of elimination as a result of this tension between femininity and white made masculine idiom of modernity. So I allowed myself to see it not as a violent process, but as a kind of integration, and allowing ourselves to choose whatever we want. And she also acted like this. She acted like the struggle for emancipation was already being won. She had such a freedom in her life paths, as the boundaries and obstacles didn't even exist. Sometimes it could look tragical because as she didn't want to join any group, and she didn't want to be recognized as a part of a movement. She, of course, stood alone very frequently, but she gained something really amazing, this freedom and this very deep humanity that was very easily seen, and she was surrounded by people who were amazed of this quality. And I want to think that it is still seen in her work. Thank you, and sorry for this long talk, but I really believe that this very deep humanity is something which is still very important, and it's very easy to feel in her works.
This, in fact, I wanted to ask about the reception of her legacy as maybe the closing question. However, as this has already came in we're now talking about this. Yes, in fact, this is a very significant moment in the reception of Wanda's works. I also think a lot about it, that it's the first time, in a way, we meet without Czełkowska, and it's a new chapter in a reception of her works, with also a lot of risk, because of course, even in when some of you have seen the exhibition in museums or some not, but of course we think about it, that maybe, probably, almost for sure, Wanda Czełkowska would install the exhibition in a totally different way. Maybe she would not like some parts of it. So this new chapter is of course fascinating, because this is also what now we try to do with the book and with the symposium, to also invite curators, researchers, academics who really didn't maybe know much about her works, but really to now open this art practice to other eyes, to people who can really bring their own research and their own perspective to the work of Wanda Czełkowska. Of course, it also follows so paths we know, and the way we work with the artists who are somehow overlooked in the art history, and how we try to bring them in light. And this is also, I think it's quite important that we also reflect on this moment and the strategies we use towards artists like Wanda, whose especially international reception on this quite big scale starts somehow now. Maybe this would be for me an interesting issue to touch upon, what strategies we use, what we are in fact doing now with the reception of Wanda Czełkowska.
Could I ask something? Could I ask a question?
Of course.
Firstly, unfortunately, I haven't been able to see the installation, and I hope that you will be able to circulate and commemorate the installation with photos. But secondly, I presume all the work is mostly still with her studio, because obviously putting her into the world, or, for example, there is going to be a curated panel of the Frieze Art Fair called Modern Women, curated by the AWARE organization. I think there's the question of her as a woman artist is important, and and she has to join a constellation. If she wouldn't like the word sisterhood or sorority, she has to join a constellation of women artists too, as well as artists who are so important in the history of Poland and so forth. So there is indeed a lot to be done. Photos will also be very valuable, and presumably you'll have a developed website in the future at the disposition of other people, with, for example, the installation photos.
Yes, I think already now you can find them on the site of Muzeum Susz. But yes, of course, we also like share and made the photo documentation of the exhibition.
I would leave you to ask somebody else. I don't know in what order you're asking people to speak.
No, I think you're very welcome to get involved in any more. Do we have Matthew with us? Because I don't see.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, but Sarah, if I had you were speaking, maybe I will just direct one question to you. Could you share your thoughts on the influence on Czełkowska work? In your text, in the Czełkowska's monographs, you suggest that her heads were incorrectly labeled as neo-primitive. Could you expand on this idea? Because in the text, there was not really enough.
Yes, I didn't have time. I've just been to the Jean Faudrier retrospective arranged by Christie's in Paris. In fact, it's to honor the catalogue raisonné of his paintings, so there were no sculptures in it. But basically, in just before he died, when he won the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale, he was somebody of huge international importance. And for various reasons, because of the how New York stole the idea of modern art discourse and everything, you know, the history of European post-war art is still not satisfactorily recounted in terms of larger movements. And it's still, of course, too monographical, because it's a huge pleasure to trace the trajectory, for example, of Cantor. And many people, I think David was also, as I was, at the symposium called Cantor Was Here, held in England. But the impact of the European informel, but also the toing and froing of artists from Poland to Paris, and the way in which European art, even, for example, the informel, contained traces of history and pain and memory, which is so central to Fautrier's art, which is not what you get with the American story. That has not been given the scholarly attention it really deserves. As I said, for various reasons to do with exhibition making, blockbuster making, and then making blockbusters about the story of Polish art, the way that, which one of the things that really irritates me is the way that socialist realist stories, including to do with Eastern Europe, are always attached to Russia and Russia's edicts, as opposed to a wider European story of European influences and counter-influences, because one could say right from the very beginning, the enormous impact of, I'm afraid to say, because some people think one's waving a flag for Paris or something, but the export of French discourse about the arts in the Soviet satellite countries, and the impact of their artists was much more important than any export of Soviet painters. And so there's a very complex situation here, but the info is so interesting. And I was so happy that, very unusually, I was able to illustrate the plaster head of Fautrier, even in his recent retrospective. In Paris, it's all the bronze works, because all the plaster works were exported to Germany. And essentially, the plaster work and its relationship to lumpy, the idea of a kind of lumpiness and mutilating of being is incredibly important in Wanda. And so I just had a kind of allergic reaction where I saw that word, which is quite understandable, neo-primitivism. That's taking me in a long trajectory when I also wanted both to congratulate the very unusual, I find, in this book, the quality of writing where there's a challenge, where people have had to talk both personally, like Agnieszka's just done, and about zeitgeist and things, when you can't do proper art history about influences. There's no specific influence, obviously, of Fautrier on her heads, except the idea of focusing on the head and the mutilated head. So I was very happy to make my minor contribution, because I was supervising June Geddes' thesis about DeMarco and that whole story. When I read DeMarco's interview here, the quality of his voice, but also the openness of his questions was interesting, because Wanda came out with these tremendously enigmatic and slightly strange answers. So I find there's a very interesting strangeness in this catalogue, both to do with the artist, the problems of not being there, joining and not joining discourses, and subjectivity. And like me, Agnieszka has had the experience of working with very old people as living and then as dead. And of course, as you say, I did meet her in a very dramatic way at the Thaddeus Ropac exhibition, where I'd just like to say, yeah, to people who weren't there, her exhibition, although it was part of this great triptych called very enigmatically Land of Lads, Land of Lashes by Anke Kemper, it was entirely honed off. It was entirely separate from the other two artists. It was in this little wooden panelled, very intimate room that was like a kind of reception room in the past, with the heads, except for the great oval, incredible late metal work, which has been written about beautifully here, but is really so unconnected with the earlier work, it seems to me. I didn't even know who it was by at first, of course. So I'm very prepared to talk again, perhaps after other people have come in with other points about that particular meeting.
Can I just at bottom refer to neo-primitivist term, just to explain for researchers, as I don't like this term at all. I think it's not really appropriate to call any art primitive. So neo-primitivist is also not the beautiful term. It was never said referring to the heads like Edinburgh heads or heads from the table, which are informal and was recognized in Poland as informal of biological abstraction or something between representation and abstraction. And neo-primitivism was, the term was used to the earlier work, which Wanda herself compared to Easter Island, big heads, and
like the portrait of the man. The portrait of yes,
with very roughly cutted, heavy faces, which kind of influence of socialist realism or the sculpture from before the war, which also this kind of heavy sculptural technique was used. So it was just for this, but I absolutely agree with you that it's not a gentle term and to use at all. And just one sentence to also finish my recognition that Wanda's position as her own person and kind of outsider was partly created by herself, and it was also a kind of myth, and she was absolutely well informed in the 70s and 80s, and even as very old person was still in touch. You met Wanda Czełkowska in New York composer, and she was really close to many artists. And as you know, Tadeusz Kantor was one of the messengers between the West and Kraków, where she spent a lot of her creative time. So I'm sure that she was, of course, she read philosophers, and the similarities with the thought of her time was absolutely conscious. Thank you.
This desire to be the individual is quite typical of her generation as well. I think people who studied through socialist realism were really wary of the idea that their work should be instrumentalized. So the declaration, I'm an individual, that my work is a kind of free creation, was extremely important for that generation who came to formation in the 1950s. And it's really striking that sort of, I mean, there's a question there about her politics. Maybe we can pick that up later, but there's this sort of then difficulty of being aligned with feminism is to do with this difficulty of being aligned to anything at all. And yes. So Abakanowicz is reluctant to do this. And if actually Poland has this remarkable generation of women artists, often working in sculpture, Szapocznikow, but also painters, Rosenstein and so on, really phenomenal a body of talent. We shouldn't be surprised by that, of course, but it's very, very striking that women did make their careers and had public profile as practitioners, and Czełkowska was showing at Krzysztofory Gallery. She showed at Współczesna in Warsaw, which was a really major center. And what I think has happened in a way is really excellent feminist scholarship has done a lot of work to put a spotlight on their practice and to ask these questions of gender which I think are important, are implicit in the work, despite the fact that these artists often kind of refuse that framing, I think, because of their formation.
But I mean, this is such an amazing image.
Yeah.
And it's described as being related to putting wet drapes on clay sculptures. I think that out of I don't know, an excess of caution, this question is not really being addressed in terms of my sort of feeling satisfied that I know more about it. It's a comparison with Françoise Janicot, the woman who bound herself up in cotton. The illustration is in the book. And you can't have somebody doing this and not interpret it in some way. It's the most extraordinary and powerful image to put on the front of this. And actually, it's a very poignant image. It's not a very I am a very powerful person image. The image of her sitting with her feet up in the air on the table in this very laid back way with these huge heads is a more powerful image. So I'm very interested that this choice was made, which I think is an arresting and fabulous choice. But then everyone is very tentative about not psychoanalyzing her or anything. There's also a portrait of her partner at one stage, and he recedes, he's invisible. I find that my curiosity, especially when then someone says the blue thing is a self-portrait, and it's such a brutal self-portrait, there's a little bit of me really wanting to know what's going on there, besides her external and very, very important history in this passage from, you know, brutalist sculpture to conceptualism. I'm the French say laisser à son fin. I'm still hungry to know more about something more interior, not necessarily engaged with, you know, feminist groups or anything, but there's an amazing question of interiority. And I'm sure Agnieszka knows from reacting with her face and reacting in conversation with her and reacting with her being that there is a big question of interiority there somewhere.
Of course. What was really striking, how vividly she would always protest against the psychoanalytical and phenomenological understanding of this image. I remember a lot of conversation between us and Eva Opałka and Wanda would get really angry. And this vividness of the protest kind of allowed us to think that there is something in this recognition, that her own hand, who are very strong and kind of masculine, and this suffocating gesture performed on a beautiful feminine head and face. It's really difficult not to read it this way, that to achieve the status of a creator, she was she decided herself to suppress her femininity in a way. So this kind of understanding was close to us, where we were working on her exhibition with Wanda and Eva. Yes, so I would never reject this understanding, but I think that Wanda, so she was very young when she, not very, but it was like 60. Sorry, I don't remember. This is a very important date. Agnieszka, could you maybe check it?
1970.
70. And later on, she acted as she solved this problem by allowing herself for taking what she wants from femininity. She was always wearing heavy makeup, like a lot of red lipstick, and also workers' trousers and boots. And for my daughter's generation, is just non-binary person who acts like this. So I like to think about Wanda as someone who conquered it. Of course, not for a society, but for herself. but you know, it's just my impression. I don't think it's.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that she wanted to look fab, basically, and she dressed very well, and it was obvious when she came to Tadeusz Ropak that it was a very big day in her life, and I thought, wow, good for you. And obviously makeup can be not to do with wanting to look prettier. It can be apotropaic. It can be kind of like a, you know, like I'm here and I'm powerful and I look good and so forth. And it can be very strong in that way. So I didn't think of it either as a kind of fancy dress or as trying to look pretty or younger or something. It looked powerful and well put together, and asserting herself as a presence. I didn't know quite how old she was when she came, but obviously she was pretty old, and she was. I respected the fact that she looked powerful and she'd cared about her presentation, and I would imagine that was always the same.
Yeah, she was 87 in London, I suppose.
Really good.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe I will now a bit turn from this. Of course, there exist quite many interpretations of these works, and some feminist researchers also really like have present different interpretations of this work. I know that now also Matylda Taszycka has also developed her own that she would like to present on this symposium after all this experience of working on the. Of course, it's also a very strong image. We use it quite a lot, and I have some doubts about it, that it cannot dominate the reception of Czełkowska work, because it works. That's the image that works, of course, but it also doesn't really represent her whole legacy. So we had very long discussions about this gesture of putting this image again, because it's also used
we did the same.
Yeah, and it's very delicate issue how much we can use this very very strong image. In the end, the decision was that in this mission that we have with this exhibition and taking Czełkowska more international, we need to use strong material, let's call it like this, and it's a very pragmatic attitude, but this very pragmatic way of thinking stands behind the decision to use this image on the cover, and as also the poster and so on. But also I think it cannot be, we need to also reflect about using this very, very strong image.
Just a small footnote there.
Yeah.
There's other bold images, other bold self-portraits, which is so striking. So either you can exceptionalize and say that this image, we're all holding the book, right, is a sort of outlier. But actually, as Sarah said, the self-portraits which are supremely aggressive, or the late 1950s self-portrait with exposed breasts, which in Poland in 1950s is also a really bold venture, and she chose to be photographed by that piece as a young woman in the context of a very censorious culture, I think is really quite interesting. So it's probably a question of how exceptional, or whether it's within the grain of a kind of running practice of self-presentation, maybe, that I think is a good art historical question here.
I agree, and maybe as we were this also image and this work with so many emotion, I would turn a bit to more conceptual issues, and I would then turn here to Matthew. And I would like to talk about Czełkowska interaction with West conceptual art. And how do you think this comparison helps in understanding her works? And where does it fall short? And what does this mismatch reveals about the uniqueness of her artistic language?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. It's funny though, because I felt like a great spectator to that discussion so far, in as much as I didn't have the pleasure of knowing her nor art until quite recently. And when Matilda invited me to think specifically about that work, it really allowed me to somehow reenact what she had been going through herself, I assume, by putting forward a notion in 1972 and then a shape in 1995. And I really enjoyed that kind of journey that allowed me to think about the moment a work of art is conceptualized through to the moment of a work of art is realized. And so therefore, all the reference that I came up with in writing that text, or that has been coming up since I've written that text, are just both an excuse to think, but also a kind of a way for me to have a frame of reference coming up. You talk so eloquently, all of you, about that image, and yet I was thinking, well, what about the element of theatricality here? And especially, the absolute elimination, the sculpture you invited me to talk about, for me is nothing else but theater. It's a stage litten, and that notion is fantastic because it brings, of course, the past that you mentioned with Tadeusz Kantor and proximity, and you feel like, well, there you go. The world's the stage, as a famous Englishman once wrote. But furthermore, we also have the, what is fascinating to me, which is that notion of the void. How do you define a void? And especially when you have both a stage and a ceiling, But also what is fascinating, though, is that it's not a conceptual gesture. It's not an instruction to be realized. It's not take any room, leave the floor as it is, and leave the ceiling as it is, and here is my sculpture. Here is my attempt at redefining sculpture. No, it has to be realized. It had to be realized back in 1995 when she was still with us, and then with you now in 2023. And I really thoroughly enjoyed this kind of conceptual materiality and physical materiality that evolves through time. Now, when I thought about theatricality and materiality, and I also was drawn to this idea of a bit of son et lumière, sound and light, space and light, rather, the space and the light defining the space, or the environment, right, defining the environment. And that's why it was interesting to me to kind of articulate this conceptual notion of the void, as in Yves Klein, Armand, but now that we should, open up to many others who have dealt with defining a void, like Bethan Hughes back in 1989 at the ICA, just showing up an empty floor, a recreation of an empty floor, or Dominique Gonzalez Foster, who would have been, as the second element of my text, which is the relationship with relational aesthetic, and how Dominique has really been putting forward a notion of the relational aesthetic dealt with by a son et lumière, sound and light, the entertainment of that. So what's interesting to me, and it's also the limit somehow of where I am, is both putting forward an appreciation of an art which is so powerful, so deep, and really is, it just blows me away, but also to which does it really have to just put it within a conceptual framework, a cosmology of others. For me, it helped make sense of it, but now I really can sense the unicity to it, this DNA, so to say.
Frankly, I had got no idea about this void piece until a certain moment. Well, I mean, until I think the end of June's chapter, and I was just knocked out by it. Obviously, there's a history of Polish conceptual art and conceptual art coming to Poland, but I was just absolutely astounded by it. And it seems to me that most people must have, because I think this Polish technique, I've had it once before, and we were all invited to a colloquium about the two sculptures, Alina Szapoknikow and the beautiful blonde Alina, whose surname I always forget.
Leszczyńska.
Yeah, and they very cunningly gave everyone an info package of everything you might possibly want to read about the person in English, and invited all the people they wanted to think about the artist. I think it's a very, very excellent strategy. But it seemed to me, whereas I had my experience of June, and I must say as well, I have a very, very contemporary and ongoing experience of Richard DeMarco. I speak to him about once every 3 weeks. I'm a fan. I've been to see him twice recently. He's 95. He's very, very impassioned. But it seems that everyone must have had access, because of reading their essays, to at least the 2016 Eva Opalka catalogue. Maybe you sent a big package of things to June, which I didn't receive, but I feel, especially in my, as it were, slightly underinformed state of not having read some of that material, I found it so exciting and so, really rather shocking. And the enterprise to create it in 95, amazing curatorial gesture. To be very frank, Polish curators and art historians and what they do, let alone the festival we had here in 2009, everything, it's always so surprising and so much stronger than other things. And I can imagine Mathieu, I participated in the Voids catalogue. I can just imagine Mathieu's also. You must have been shocked, Mathieu, weren't you?
Oh, definitely, absolutely.
I mean, just completely shocked by this.
It's also that great revelation. It's just, no, I did not know the word, but to see the conceptual framework that came out of that was, for me, just outstanding. And it's funny, we spoke when I was writing the text also, so how you guys going to recreate that work, what are you going to do? We knew that and that's also the kind of the, and I'd say using the word limit in a positive way, what limits are we going to have? It's not going to be the same slabs, but it's going to be slabs nonetheless. It's not going to be the same light, but it's going to be lights nonetheless. So, a bit like when we did The Void, and together with John Amnader, we said, well, when we do such a show, we got it all wrong. And, by recreating a work like that, you get it all wrong by making it right. You make it right by presenting it and making it available. But of course, it's never going to be what she wanted in 72, and it cannot be what it was in 95. I got that fantastic picture of her in front of me walking over the slabs, and it's so gorgeous. For me, you use the gallery as a work of art. I make the gallery as a work of art, and you win my heart. And that's exactly what I see in that picture back in 95. It's absolutely outstanding to me just to see that. So yes, it was another puzzle to that great nothingness.
I mean, I involved two comparisons, but where those comparisons come from are two different things, especially Martin Creed, who was considered to be so sensational with his lights going on and off in Tate, with or without some Morse code score or not. I don't even have the faintest idea. It's so different. And it's also, one does have to say, as an art historian, we do love to know about dates. It's so early. It's so early for embracing the whole space. As you say, there's a theatrical tradition, but what I really love are these great, great conceptual surprises.
Oh, they are.
Surprise of her oeuvre,
yeah.
But also in terms of that particular work, the surprise.
No, absolutely. It's a surprise, and it's a magnificent gesture to do. It's, it takes courage, it takes decision, it takes engagement to really reach that level of doing. And also, yeah, it's the beauty. You mentioned we see lights, we think of Martin Creed, but also we think of Michael Archer when you just turn off the gallery, the lights in the gallery, and there you go. You have a work of art in Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. So what's beautiful, and which actually was probably exactly the same year as the conceptualization of the piece. So there's both the notion of zeitgeist and say, okay, this is the spirit of the time. Maybe just infuse something in the beverage, and there you go. This work comes out, but then the legacy keeps on coming and giving. And that's what's fascinating with a work like that. There's both a score to be followed and a work of art to be experienced.
And it's not a hard act to follow, but it's a hard. Now you've done your beautiful retrospective to put this into, London, New York, Paris, somewhere. It's got to move from Souche, which is a marvelous, marvelous scholarly enterprise with a great team. I know it's a changing team. I know Anke Kempis, who did that show in London, who always does her best to make things happen. But it's got to move to somewhere more important institutionally. But that work is a huge challenge to say to an institution, could you please restage that piece? That's one of the problems, isn't it?
That's really was a huge thing to do, to reconstruct. In fact, to produce it from the scratch, that's the work you have to do, to produce it and bring like I don't know how many tons of beton, concrete were brought to Muzeum Susz. Now, it was really, we didn't know what we are doing.
But you did it very well.
I think we should pay the credit to Ona Winogrodzka, Wanda's niece and heir of her oeuvre. And Ona Winogrodzka is architect herself, and she is the closest family member to Wanda, and she really did amazing work with redecorating her studio into the museum. At first, it was very hard for me to understand that how one can change the Wanda's really amazing order, a maze of stuff and things in the studio. But Ona Winogrodzka decided to turn it into kind of museum, and I had the pleasure to show it to Agnieszka and later to David, and it is a beautiful experience to enter the space. So I think the Susz team, and together with Ona Winogrodzka, who is responsible for the estate, I think it's really great team for producing the next exhibitions.
Hear, hear.
David, did you want to add something?
Just to jump back, I mean, I think a work like that also raises a really interesting art historical methodological question as well. So, and this is not a criticism, but we can do the job of affinity. We can find echoes, right? And I think that enables us to travel across time and find echoes to Martin Creed and so on. And that does a lot to make sure that the work feels current and contemporary and so on. But I'm also, you know, as a historian, really interested in how could an idea like that be generated in 1972 in Poland? And what company might we put it in? And I mean, in a way, we might want to go to Lucy Lippard and so on, and that's totally appropriate. But what's really striking is that there's a lot of conceptual practice at the end of the 60s in Poland, which is sort of interested in the disappearance of things, you know, light sculpture. So Staszewski does, you know, if you go to the Wrocław Symposium at the beginning of the decade, or Rosowowicz, who asks, how do we have a kind of neutral art practice? How do we have non-effect? Well, we kind of have installations that are made by musicians, you know, like so Krause, Morel, and Teresa Kelm make a major piece in Współczesna. So this is not to do the work down, you know, the elimination piece, but to ask what's its company in that moment, and what is the currency of different ideas in Poland at the time, because they're not reading Lippard, but there is clearly quite a smart and sophisticated discourse going on. And this is a kind of intellectual archaeology. Maybe it's not an exhibition question, but it's a good art historical question as well.
Oh, most definitely. And you would have a conceptual art that's crossing the borders anyhow.
Yeah.
You know, and it's also interesting. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that work, you know, has the seed in Poland, but conceptualized in Edinburgh. So what does this mean?
Yep.
However, to come to the point you've just made, you're absolutely right. You know, yes, they would have been exposed to the work of Daniel Buren or Robert Barry, Lawrence Winner, you know, the adventures of Cecigula, but also the equivalents of art and language since the mid-1960s, but also, you know, so all these ramifications must be at play somehow. But that's true, you know, that would have been when we look very briefly with Matilda in her writing, in Wanda's writings, or in all the kind of documentation we could have access to, this kind of historical framework did not spring up, though. It was not something that came up lively to when we were looking at it then.
See, my immediate response is to think, this is so fascinating, as you've described it, right, as a kind of stage for an absence. And I start thinking about Poland in the early 1970s, you know, and there's a big debate in Warsaw about what constitutes the real avant-garde, and do we have a kind of fictitious avant-garde that are just somehow retreading a whole set of ideas that have already been well established. So here you've got this sort of gallery where you've got all the apparatus, the armature for work of art, but the work of art is absent. So we could start to read this as political commentary if we wanted to, right? It's a kind of invitation. And forgive me, but Czełkowska was obviously you know, a kind of tricky character in some ways. She wasn't always happy with the interpretations of her work. Now, clearly, it's sad that she's no longer with us, but the work has a kind of freedom now to become many different kinds of things, and that's its richness, is its capacity to function in all these different ways.
Absolutely.
And I do regret her passing. I'm not saying that as a...
And I think it's nice for us to remember the contributions to this kind of question of people like Amelia Jones in the catalogue, who can't be with us in the symposium, because the way her work can kind of bounce between different people and different people's responses just shows its toughness, really, that it can be porous and tough at the same time, and actually excite people like Amelia Jones. And remember, Amelia Jones comes from performance too, and I think that and that comparison with Janicot was also a performer, and there's a very performative aspect, I think, even in putting the heads on the table. And the environment of other people who were quite performative, like Abakanowicz, whom she experienced when she was in Edinburgh, and the importance of performance as performance, not just theatrical performance, which was part of the milieu of conceptual art when she was working, that gives what she does and her brave gestures, because it's very non-useful to think of the table as a ready-made that's slightly larger than life. It's part of all this world of props, and I read about how she made the props for the people for the school for the canto performance, which I didn't know about before. She's very much in that milieu of different art forms, and of going to see different art forms while she's doing her art form. I think it's an amazingly rich moment of interdisciplinary contact between all those art practices, which we don't have now. They're all hived off, really. At least they are in London, I think. And one feels an incredible envy, really, for those magical years of newness and excitement and interdisciplinarity.
Maybe I would just add one thing about the absolute elimination of sculpture as a notion of form. In fact, it's the installation which opens the exhibition in Muzeum Susz. You enter the exhibition. It's like really in the biggest, in fact, the first space you enter, and of course, the general question. I think it's a very interesting gesture, because the question which I think you need to ask once you realize what is this work, what can be done further? And I think, because it has those, it could be the last work, you just encounter these thoughts, but for Czełkowska, it was not the last work. And when we also speak about all those parallels with minimalist art, conceptual art of this, I think what is extremely interesting that she is really very different, because the way she work with the materiality, it's like really very specific. And maybe I think it would be interesting now a bit to expand this issue. About the materiality of Czełkowska sculptures. Although she created such strong conceptual works, she never abandoned the use of materials in her work, including plaster, canvas, and some constructions elements. These aspects remained present even towards the end of her life. And what do you think? Do you think this reflects a certain contradiction or internal conflict with her artistic practice, or how would you interpret her strong attachment to the sculptural craft, in fact, in context of this monumental work of absolute elimination of sculpture?
Maybe I don't find it contradictory. I was talking with Wanda about it many times, how important for her was the sculpture craft, the sculpting as a craft, and all the materials and tools and gestures and procedures. And for her, it was her language. it is kind of language which she used, and she absolutely extended the meaning of every materials, tools, and gestures when she was using the raw canvas, or sometimes she used the inside structure of a sculpture, showing just the inside, the construction, which usually is hidden inside the sculpture. But it was her absolutely conscious decision to use this language of this craft because she considered herself as a sculptor. And she read philosophers, she wrote some text, but it was her conscious decision that she is a sculptor, and the art and the process of creation, the art, happened in the studio with the matter. She never illustrated the verbalized conception with the sculpture. It was always the matter what was first, and this was just the decision to follow the materiality of things, which was always very striking for me. A kind of post-humanistic approach to other beings, to animals, and to objects even. So she was listening to the sculptures, she was listening to tools and to the matters, and she was always used this phrase like, they are very happy here. The sculptures are very happy in this installation, or no, we cannot put it here. It would be absolutely unhappy here and lose its all energy. So I think the materiality is super
But at the same time, she was formulating like thoughts like this. For example, this is an quotation. From the beginning, I was not involved in a problem of form, but in the expression of my thoughts and ideas, which for me at the moment makes sense a bit in contradiction. What's like there is for me a tension in her work.
Yes, but it's the abstract idea, the visual idea. It's not necessarily verbalized and expressed in a language. I think this was very important.
So I would maybe now turn to David Crowley with a question which issue that appears in your text. You draw attention to the coexistence of two forms of expression in Czełkowska work. On one hand, the modernist grid, as described by Rosalind Krauss, and on the other hand, the organic, public forms of heads or planets. There wasn't really a room for further exploration of this idea in your text, and I'm curious about how you interpret the convergence of these words within a single piece like Black Frieze, as well in the broader context of Czełkowska's body of work.
Well, just to set the context a little bit, the invitation to write about Black Frieze came, I'm guessing, partly because it's a slightly unusual work. It's not had attention from many other writers. Really brilliant writers will often sort of invoke it without analyzing it. So it sits as this slightly anomalous work. And in the phase of her career, it seems to be coming out of the heads. And when she steps into this kind of space of geometry somehow, so it's a kind of interesting moment. So avoid the pun here, but it felt a bit like a blank canvas in a way to be able to do some kind of interpretive work with it. And in some ways to think about the grid as this sort of modernist preoccupation, and then these really strange and kind of wonderful drawings that she produces, which have profiles perhaps of the human head, but sort of suggest this sort of amazing capacity to be microcosm and macrocosm, these sort of bubbling spaces. And I think they're wonderful. I think they're really extraordinarily beautiful drawings. So to see these things sitting side by side was an attempt at kind of analysis here. And it's entirely kind of speculative because it's built on some legs that don't necessarily sort of stand. You know, the relationship with Lem that I write about is very propositional, partly because they're both in Kraków at the same time. But maybe there's a little bit of a lens for then thinking about some of the other works. There's no space to do this, but the wall piece, it shares a lot of these affinities, right? It has both this sort of bubbling organic quality, and yet it's also a grid. It's rigid. It's a table sitting on its side. So it seems to be a kind of patterning in her work that maybe opens up other doors of analysis, but it is highly speculative. Agnieszka, you know the work very well. What do you think about that type of reading?
I love it, and I'm very grateful to you that you mentioned that it's that she might be not very happy, and she might protest against this reading. And definitely, it's not illustration, but she was also very interested in modern science, in quantum physics. So for me, like, I ended my text also with this with mention of quantum physics and the void and all the particles as a lump of energy, and also the head you mentioned, they are organic and kind of bubble, but also very mechanical sometimes.
Yeah.
They're like a lot of mechanism inside of them. So so I really like this your association. Yeah, and I think that that if I have to choose, I'm very happy that we don't have to choose. What was heavier and more important for her, the emancipation discourse of emancipation and the body and feelings, or the philosophy of being and the world and consciousness as something wider than humanity? I would choose the second.
That's very interesting, and that runs throughout many of the texts. It's a subtext of many of the essays in the book, although it's not always strongly declared.
Yeah, it was really such a pleasure to read all of your text and all the book and the beautiful visual essay created by Antonina Gugała. That without Wanda, her works is so striking, and it was a lot of similarities in all those recognitions, which is a kind of proof that the direction is genuine.
And we haven't really said so much apart from the complexity and the atomic dimensions of her paintings, because when I went into that Tadeusz Ropak installation, you have that installation shot in my essay, those enormous round coloured things that were going up and down were extraordinary. And then I read the essays about when they were blue and the idea of the blue point, which was very complex. But I mean, she's a powerful painter on a very large scale, taking her place with other painters of the period. And this painting isn't known. It's really fantastic stuff. And not afraid of these bright colours when she's working sculpturally, not just in monochrome, but quite frankly, of course, it was not exactly a modernist gesture, but it was a very elegant gesture to keep polychrome sculpture out of Tadeusz Ropak. When I saw the big blue things and the big green things, again, I thought, goodness me, what a surprise again. So that punchiness and that fearlessness is really going all the way through. But again, I just wanted to make a point about the powerfulness of her painting and its kind of fearlessness. And as you say, David, the microcosm, macrocosm aspect of it is huge.
Yeah, it's a great job done by Matilda to show so many paintings. I think it was never done before. It was always sculptures, installation, and those drawings on raw canvas. But oil paintings, it's just the first time at its beautiful room with paintings.
They were in conservation, yes. In fact, they were in such a bad state
a long process of
that's
conservation.
There's in fact possibility when they are after renovation, and they could be presented in an exhibition. But I would like to turn to one issue that in fact that appears in text by Sarah Wilson. This is the political aspect of Czełkowska work, which I would say in Poland, I think it was never interpreted in this way. Of course, also because of the communist context, that more or less we always say that everything at the time was political. But then I think your perspective, Sarah, was for me very interesting, because you bring this notion of politicality from totally like different angle. And maybe you could also like a bit expand this issue.
Well, I can't quite remember what I said, although I have recently reread it. But I know you
Her works were
the
obviously political.
The multiplication of the heads, and they're the kind of moronic way of representing the masses. Yes, I did feel that very strongly, because one could imagine differentiation of heads, even if they were political or hostage heads like Fautrier. And the fact that they're specifically the same, and they've been molded to be the same, and they've been brutalized. Sophia Kulik also spoke to me very eloquently when I first met her about being brutalized and stripped, and was not as complex as language in the late 1930s. Of course, there's the paring down of language because of the importation of existential types of plays, a kind of, reception of Samuel Beckett in terms of strippings of language and existential predicaments. But I also felt the violence and the brutalization and the denial of the individual in that work. And because of my vicarious experiences of Cantor, but including an exhibition held in Strasbourg, which recreated the school with pieces by Balker and was called Silence. I do feel, and my own readings of existentialism, I do feel that silence is very pregnant with memory, atrocity, the unsaid, of course, the Holocaust memory, which one never wants to overemphasize, of course, but there is that question of a kind of heaviness. And I've just been with my former professor at Oxford, who's spent most of her career in America, and she's just been in a conference in Warsaw. She's writing a book about forests, but she had never been to a Polish forest which was full of memorials and burials and human remains and presences which are not talked about when you're looking at the trees of the forest. So I personally feel very attuned to those kind of readings. And the formalist, some of the formalist readings were very pleasurable to read too, but I do feel that that's part of the richness and implications of the silence, and also the idea of repetition and molding as a process, and molding as in taking away individuality from the concept of a portrait bust.
Yeah, Sarah, I wanted to thank you for this interpretation, and thank you, Agnieszka, for bringing this subject, because in the 70s it was not allowed, the critics were not allowed to write about it. In 2000s, it was not trendy anymore to see art as political gesture, and I really like your recognition, and there's definitely something in it. And Wanda had very strong political views, and it was very up to date in the 70s, and I think it's very up to date now. We are 2 weeks in front, very important election, and this process of unification and people being put in a game in front of each other. It's very political, and it's sadly very actual also now. So thank you. We will think about it.
It just strikes me as a small thing in a way, but she could have had a completely different career, but she chose not to follow the path of many sculptors. Her generation would have been making public monuments and would have had really quite a comfortable career. There were many Kraków sculptors who really enjoyed the benefits of commissions because they were very happy to take on that. So the early 60s, you see a couple of examples where she's attempting to step into that monument space, but then she doesn't really go there. So you could start to think about this as a counter practice, as counter monuments and so on, which I think is really interesting. And then, you know, Silence also in 1981, 82, where she sort of refuses to show, is also another political action around the time of martial law, Stan Wojenny. So it's sort of hinted at in the research of quite a few people, but I think it would be a very good direct question to ask, what is the politics of Czełkowska's practice?
Well, also, you know, you talk about going there, but there's the going back, which was really striking. 1972, she's in Edinburgh, she has an opportunity to stay there and remain, and no, she comes back. And I think that, for me, that was a very, very strong gesture as well, you know, so that's also a very political, clearly a very political act, and also a very political way of living.
Agnieszka, did you have any sense of her view of the market? Because when I went to her studio, what I was so surprised by was that all of the work is there, that she's sold very little. Now, maybe the opportunity wasn't there to sell, or maybe she didn't want to sell. I wonder if you have a sense of her market views.
Yeah, like she would be always against the power which was dominate the scene at the time. So she was very much against the socialist realism while she was studying in the toughest years. As you know, the socialist realism in Poland it was introduced by force only like 3 or 4 years actually, and she studied during this year, and she never did anything like that. She worked on some monuments with her master Ksawery Dunikowski, but only for the money, and she also never chose this path. She always refused to be shown in an exhibition of women artists or exhibition for environment. However, she was a feminist. She was very into like ecology, and she would fight for the nature, but she would never agree to take part in any ideologized exhibition. And also she recognized, I think, very early that the market is also very powerful force, which can be dangerous for the young artists who are just eaten by the market very rapidly, and we were talking about it. But it was not that she didn't want to sell. She would like to sell for a good price. She considered, as many artists, the price as a kind of recognition, and she always refused. You could ask Anke Kempkes about how difficult it was to sell anything, or about Bauka. But it was also kind of contradiction in this. You saw so many work in a good state, but it is all grateful to activity of Ona Winogrodzka during the last year. It was such a strange that for Wanda, all her work were very important, but she treated them terribly. She used them as a wall, or she put them in the window in front of the bright light and even the rain. So it was so many contradictions in her, and also like self-harming or self-sabotaging gesture. And her approach to the market was exactly like this. She was very happy, as Sarah told us in London. She felt that it's important. However, she refused to sell because it always like not enough money, or not a good collector. Yeah, so happily is still a body of work present in one hand, but it's not gigantic, so it's not a really thrill for the market. It's so the the task of making her well recognized all over the world, it's difficult also because of that the work are amazing, and really it's not difficult to introduce people to her art, but it's not much of this. It's quite a closed sense.
Also, selling the works would mean that this amazing studio, which is such amazing space, would disappear. The atmosphere will disappear, and this is the studio. It's a really like very important factor and extremely strong experience to enter the studio. I think for everyone who has the possibility to really go there and see that how sculpture can become also the family. When you said that you don't treat, that she didn't treat the sculptures well, it so fits well when you enter the studio and you feel that she really lives among the sculpture and they became part of her family in a way.
Yeah, of course, it was a family. But
which you treat
yeah. Yeah. Once again, I would to mention Ona Winogrodzka, and it's a really heavy burden to take care about such an amazing space, and so she really needs our support.
Yeah, so I think with this conclusion, we will now finish the conversation. And I would like to thank you very much. It was really, for me, also a great pleasure to learn from you and from your thoughts and opinion. And I'm really curious to see what will happen with Czełkowska's legacy in next years, because I really have this very strong awareness that it's a totally new chapter and we don't really know yet the future.
Thank you for helping us to get to this point, all of you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.